Hi, this is Stephen and Juliet from Living Letters.
Hi.
Thrilled to do our next episode, number 4, of Becoming Naomi. We've been looking at Naomi's point of view through the story of Ruth. And when we finished chapter 1, which was episode 3, we saw that Naomi had hit rock bottom, was empty because she had returned home without her husband and her 2 children. And yet we saw she's not completely empty because Ruth, her Moabite daughter-in-law, has traveled back with her. But she's at this place where she's just completely hopeless, or at least almost completely hopeless, and bitter, and feels like the Lord is against her, understandably. And yet she had heard the Lord had reversed the famine and had shown concern for his people, so that brought them from Moab back to Bethlehem. And that's where the story ends at the end of chapter 1. So chapter 2 begins with Ruth coming to Naomi in the state and saying, "Let me go out and gather food for us in the fields." And Naomi just says, "You may go, my daughter." And so that was in the morning, and we're going to look at the end of that day, where Naomi has no idea what has been happening.
And a whole lot of stuff happened during that day.
And she could have never expected what was going to happen when Ruth came home at the end of the day. So we're going to start in chapter 2, verses 17.
So Ruth gathered grain in the field until evening, and when she threshed what she had gathered, it came to about 30 pounds of barley. Ruth carried 30 pounds of barley back to town, and I, her mother-in-law, saw how much grain she had gathered. Then Ruth gave me the roasted grain she had saved from the mealtime, and I asked her, "Where did you gather grain today? Where did you work? May the one who took notice of you be rewarded." So Ruth told me, her mother-in-law, with whom she had worked. She said, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." And I said to my daughter-in-law, "May he be rewarded by the Lord, for this man has shown loyalty to the living on behalf of the dead." I then said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours. He is our kinsman redeemer." Ruth the Moabite replied, "He even told me, 'You may go along beside my servants until they have finished gathering all my harvest.'" I then said to my daughter-in-law, Ruth, "It is good, my daughter, that you should go out to work with his female servants. That way you will not be harmed, which could happen in another field." So Ruth worked beside Boaz's female servants, gathering grain until the end of the barley harvest as well as the wheat harvest. After that, she stayed home with me, her mother-in-law.
I love this exercise because it really takes us into what Naomi was feeling and kind of going play by play in what happened. What do you think we learn from Naomi's point of view?
Oh my goodness. I mean, first of all, you learn a little bit more of the desolation she was experiencing because she had nothing, no provisions to offer her daughter-in-law. We heard that from her in chapter 1. And here Ruth comes walking back home with what is tantamount to a month's salary back in that time. And Naomi's shocked. You can hear it. She says, where did you gather grain? Who did you work with? And whoever was part of making this happen deserves blessing. This is how outrageous this provision is. And then what's so interesting is when you see the hopeless, embittered Naomi from chapter 1 experiencing some of her flesh and bone needs being met, you sense her spirit reawakening and some hope. She goes on to tell Ruth, "What you don't even know, this man is a relative of ours. He's actually our kinsman redeemer," which there could be more to this story. And I mean, I guess every time I do this exercise, it just it takes me out of my own reality and thrusts me into theirs and shows me what this woman is going through.
And I think we've all experienced those times where we see nothing good that is happening, going around us, when all of a sudden like something totally unexpected and surprising happens that changes everything.
And then what about those times when those things do happen and we don't even recognize it as provision from our Heavenly Father? But here, even Naomi in her bitterness and her tragedy, after having lost through death her husband and her 2 sons, she sees that this is from the Lord, and that the Lord should bless back whomever did this.
Yeah, and the reason she comes back home to Bethlehem is she had heard the Lord had shown concern by reversing the famine. And so this abundance of food is showing that the Lord was true. What she heard is now actually happening. And again, it gets connected with this person that has been radically generous to her. And it's this kinsman redeemer. And that role of kinsman redeemer was somebody who, we'll probably talk about it in a later video, but somebody who is advocating for family members that are poor, that are in awful situations, that are there to redeem them. And so not only is this a momentary, like, we're hungry and we need food today, but it's like food coming up soon, and actually could this be somebody that is going to provide them a home, a husband, this longer sense of being taken care of. And so in the span of a day, you see everything turned around.
Yes.
And you see her generous character, just like she showed with Orpah and Ruth, when she was like, I want you guys to go home and find security in the home of a husband and a family. Here you see her immediately saying, I want this man who did this to be blessed. And then you see her advocate for her, saying, yes, you need to go into the fields, and also be careful of the female servants.
Stay with them.
Make sure that you're with them so that nothing is going to harm you. And so we see Naomi's character continuing to care more for other people, more than even of herself, even if she's been in all this situation. And so I just think this is an extraordinary, situation to live through. And I think the last thing that's emphasized is that, we've got the barley harvest and the wheat harvest at the end. So this is continuing on for several months, but then it comes to an end. And she stays home with her mother-in-law. And so even though there's been this hope, there's this person who's going to hopefully do something long-term. It actually comes to an end. And I think this paves the way for the next scene, in which Naomi and Ruth decide to do something quite risky to figure out how they're going to secure this long-term security.
Well, what Stephen's pointing out is there's definitely a pause in the story at this point, and it's very purposeful.
Yes.
So what we didn't mention is make sure to go to our YouTube channel or our Facebook page and find the other episodes if you want to catch up, if you haven't seen 1, 2, and 3.
Yep. And next time we'll look at chapter 3. Fun one. Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye.